All right, good afternoon, everybody. Happy Earth Day.
Hey.
Happy Earth, yes, that's what, this is the Earth Day spectacular lecture. I'm Doug Rogers from the Department of Anthropology. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today, Simony Howe and Dominic Boyer. Let me first thank the Department of Anthropology Colloquium Series and the Yale Climate and Energy Institute's lecture series called Nature, Culture, Action, which has been run this year to great success by Sadie Randall and Chris Hebden. 9 lectures, was it? 9, 8, 9? An enormous amount of work, so thank you guys for putting that together, and I understand there will be more next year, so stay tuned. Simony Howe is an associate professor of anthropology at Rice University, where she also teaches in the Women's Gender Sexuality Studies program. She's done fieldwork in Nicaragua for over a decade, and this is the subject of her 2013 book, Intimate Activism, Sexual Rights in Post-Revolutionary Nicaragua, which traces the long and ultimately successful struggle to repeal the most repressive anti-sodomy law in the Americas. I have not managed to read the book myself yet, but I can give you an even better recommendation, which is that people are talking about this book. I've heard about it from multiple independent sources who tell me that this is an important and methodologically innovative and enormously imaginative study of in the anthropology of activism and LGBTQ rights and sexuality. Dominic Boyer is professor of anthropology at Rice University. Dominic, as many of you know, is one of anthropology's foremost experts on expertise, as well as intellectuals and professionals more broadly, especially in the fields of journalism and media, but across a whole number of domains. These long-term interests have taken him to a wide variety of directions, from his first book, Spirit and System, on German intellectual culture, to his third book, just published last year, and entitled The Life Informatic, about the transformations that accompany digital media in the US and Europe. In between, he's found time to write on an extraordinary range of topics, including an article which I'll be teaching later this week, and with which I always conclude my undergraduate class on the former Soviet Union. This is an article that some of you have probably read in Cultural Anthropology that compares late Soviet political satire. This is co-written with Alexei Yurchak, and late liberal political satire, notably the Colbert Report and things like this. It's a great article to teach and fantastically insightful about a whole number of things. Over the past few years, Simony and Dominic have been working on a new and shared set of interests that they're going to talk about today, about energy in Oaxaca and in anthropology more generally. Before they do that, though, the last thing I want to mention is that even as they develop this new field of research, and even as they have taken on 2/3 of the editorial director responsibilities at Cultural Anthropology in recent times, they have been instrumental in putting together Rice's Center for Energy and Environmental Research in the Human Sciences, which Dominic now directs, and they've both been heavily involved in. This is the first energy studies center in the US that is based in the humanities and humanistic social sciences, rather than the more traditional physical sciences and engineering fields. I was there a couple of years ago when it was just getting started, and I can tell you what a unique and stimulating intellectual experience it was for me to give a paper and then to be involved in a day's worth of papers and conversations that included people in religion and English and all sorts of humanities fields, rather than the more hard or social sciencey and natural sciencey conversations with which I've become used to. So this is terrific. The center continues to grow by leaps and bounds. So if you are interested in or working on energy, keep your eyes on Simony, Dominic, and Rice. Without further ado.
Thank you. All right. I don't know if we probably don't really need to worry too much about miking this, I suppose, but I'll just move this here. Thank you so much, Doug. That was so touching. It's tears in my eyes. And on Earth Day, no less, to have such wonderful words of praise. And thanks also to Chris, to Ryan, to Sadie, and everyone else who helped make it possible for us to come here. It's a great treat to come to Yale. It seems like spring has finally come too, after what we understand was a very long, hard northern winter. So congratulations for having made it through. As Doug said, this is a collaborative project front to finish, and we've sort of into the final laps of it. I guess all we have to do, just write those books now. And those books are going to take an interesting form that we're happy to talk more about later on. We're going to do a duograph rather than 2 monographs, and we're happy to explain what that means. So this is sort of a piece that's drawn from that process of beginning to come back from a year's very exciting, challenging field research come to terms with some of the bigger issues that came up in that research. And so we'll give the presentation essentially in two parts. I'll give the first part and Simone will give the second. And then we're really looking forward to your feedback. So let's start off with an encounter with transnational green capitalism on the frontier of Mexican statecraft. It happened in February 2013 in Oaxaca's Isthmus of Tehuantepec, where a state police checkpoint had been set up just before the road from the district capital Juchitán turned southeast toward the village of Álvaro Obregón. Checkpoint somewhat overstates the formality of the situation. There were a few state police trucks idling by the side of the road, near several weathered wooden canoes, signs of having crossed over into the fishing zone of the Laguna Superior. The police half-heartedly reviewed our papers, but only because we asked Senor Tomas, our taxi driver for the day, to stop the car. A representative of the Oaxacan government had told us that morning that the situation in Álvaro was very tense. The police were reporting trucks filled with men driving around the village, brandishing sticks and machetes, threatening violence. Senor Tomas, by contrast, assured us that we had very little to worry about. Driving through the verdant ranch land south of Juchitán, he had explained how resistance is always tied to money in the isthmus. He said, "This is how it always is. People make a lot of noise about this or this other thing, but it's just because they want to be paid, and when they get paid, all this resistance will dry up. You'll see." What we didn't expect to see on that road, and the reason why we asked Senor Tomas to pull over, were two gringos talking to the local police commander. The tall one turned out to be someone we'd been pursuing for some time, Andrew Chapman, part of the senior management team of Mareña Renovables, a consortium seeking to build the largest single-phase wind park in all of Latin America. 132 turbines with a production capacity of 396 megawatts, enough electricity to power nearly 500,000 homes. But everyone around Juchitán knew that Mareña was in deep trouble. Its park was designed to stretch across a sandbar at the southern end of the laguna, from the Biniza or Zapotec community of Álvaro across to the Icots or Wave communities of Santa Maria del Mar and San Dionisio del Mar. Originally scheduled for completion by the end of 2012, the project suffered delay after delay before becoming the focal point for a resistance movement against wind power organized by popular assemblies, asambleas populares, across the lagunal area. And you see here the sites in which the Mareña project was to be built. The asambleas are, as Simone will discuss in more detail, community-level self-governance projects united against all governmental and industrial megaproyectos or megaprojects in the region. By the end of 2012, blockades had been erected both in Álvaro and in San Dionisio to prevent the inception of Mareña's construction. Crisis ensued. Indeed, just the day before our taxi ride, the president of Mareña's board of directors, Jonathan Davis Arsac, had threatened that the company, in what they estimated to be a 13 billion peso, or nearly $1 billion investment, would leave Oaxaca unless what he described as rule of law could be guaranteed. Davis claimed that there were only 20 well-identified people resisting this park, what he and the Oaxacan news media characterized as a violent and unscrupulous minority of political opportunists, most of them not even from the region, who were blackmailing project developers. Mareña was unwilling or unable to believe that large numbers of Isthmeños would reject a project that the developers viewed as hugely beneficial to them. This is a computer-generated graphic of what the sandbar might have looked like had the project been built. Even if we'd become to be suspicious about the public minimization and demonization of the opposition movement, we found it hard not to sympathize with Chapman personally. He spoke to us openly, shouting himself hoarse over the wind. He seemed like a man desperate to be heard. Quote, "My job is to go in there and try to open a dialogue and to go listen, but I can't do that with threats of violence. The only way to change minds is to listen to people, but if you're not allowed to listen to people, what do? We got this project that I really believe is good for the planet, good for the region, good for the people down here. And the people, Chapman felt sure, would come around," he continued. "You can't help but be stunned by the beauty of this place. And then you see how the people are living. And I'm trying not to just impose my American values here, but I don't think lousy medical care is a good thing, that lousy schools are a good thing. So if you can funnel resources into these communities to improve those services, imagine where they could be in 5 or 10 years. They can be fishing the lagoons, but they'd have basic stuff like electricity that's continuous, like transportation, like schools. It may sound very idealistic, but that's actually what we're trying to do. And to be confronted with this violence and with people who are essentially lying about what we're trying to accomplish," he trailed off, the conflict obviously wearying him. And a moment later he concluded, "I just find it frustrating. frustrating and sad, and the consequence is that the investor group I represent, they're sitting in their offices in New York, and they can put their money here, they can put their money there, and they're just going to say to themselves, why? I don't need these problems. I'm not actually in the business of saving the world. I'm in the business of earning money for my fiduciaries, and I need to do that in a low-risk way. More bad news came minutes later from the police. There was no way they were going to advise Chapman to enter Alvaro that day. The risks were, as predicted, too high. The state police have come to treat those opposing the wind park with a great deal of caution. Memories are still fresh of the previous November when Mareña and the police tested the Alvaro blockade during the Day of the Dead festival, when many in the resistance were elsewhere tending to the graves of deceased family and friends. With several protesters hauled off to detention in Juchitán and others quieted with pepper spray, the blockade was temporarily broken, allowing company workers to access the sandbar and begin topographic and vegetation removal work. But only hours later, a much larger crowd of several hundred rallied to chase the police and company off, overturning trucks and taking construction equipment hostage. We arrived in Alvaro only minutes after the police sped out of town to find the opposition more galvanized than ever. One of the leaders told us, machete at his hip, if they want to see blood, here we are, we're ready. The police never quite found the nerve to come back, and construction on the Mareña Renovables park has still not, as of today, begun. Indeed, it seems increasingly likely that it will never begin, and that the project will fail despite strong support from all levels of the Mexican government and generous international financing, despite new policy regimes favorable to renewable energy development, despite almost uniformly positive media coverage in the national and regional press, and despite the leverage of powerful international investors, including the Australian investment bank Macquarie and the Japanese firm Mitsubishi. The marriage of Mexico's aggressive renewable energy campaign, its high electricity tariffs, and the world-class wind resources of the Isthmus seem to all parties to be highly auspicious. In a matter of less than a decade, more than a dozen wind parks have come on grid in Mexico, according to industry experts, the densest development of wind energy anywhere in the world. Investors continue to flock to the Isthmus, while international renewable energy advocates have lauded Oaxacan wind power development for its positive contributions to climate change. The Mareña project alone could have offset up to 879,000 tons of carbon dioxide a year. But Mareña is above all a story about impasse and failure. And in this paper, we'd like to explore the reasons why such a diversely supported and ecologically timely project never came to be. Staying true to the complexity of the case, in lieu of an argument for a single decisive causality, we offer a bundle of reflections on the diverse challenges facing programs of energy transition, especially in parts of the world like the Isthmus of Tehuantepec that have long been marginalized or abandoned by their governing states. Of course, it's no secret that large-scale projects of energy development are often controversial, especially when the intense energy needs of translocal governance and industry are perceived as threatening local sovereignty and interests. And Mexico has been no stranger to such conflicts until the 1980s, for example. Mexico had the largest population displaced by hydropower projects anywhere in the world. But the Isthmus of Tehuantepec also has a long political and cultural history of resistance to the hegemony of Oaxaca Valley elites and to the nationalist overtures and arms of Mexico City. Few histories of the Isthmus, formal or informal, do not invoke and reinscribe an Isthmeño tradition of struggle against external power. Narratives often begin before the Spanish conquest with Isthmeños depicted as the last true Zapotecs, after the Aztecs made the northern Zapotecs their minions, assimilating them culturally and linguistically. Then one is reminded of revolt after revolt in the 19th century, of how national and Oaxacan hero Benito Juarez never broke the will of Juchitán even though he burned it. One hears how brave Juchitecos later fought valiantly against the French invasion of Mexico and helped secure the victory of the Mexican Revolution. But when that national revolution turned corrupt in the second half of the 20th century, Isthmeños rose again with their peasant and student movement, COSEI, helping to accelerate the dissolution of the pre-party state in the 1980s. In all such stories, the Isthmus is frequently identified as the place where the sovereign powers of Oaxacan state and Mexican national governance end, where, as in Alvaro Obregón, the police fear to tread. Yet Mareña's impasse also has reasons quite contemporary, illuminating deep tensions and paradoxes in dominant paradigms of renewable energy development across the world. As elsewhere in neoliberalism, market and entrepreneurial-oriented approaches to energy transition are trumpeted as the most effective and rational solutions to anthropogenic climate change. Large-scale renewable energy projects like wind parks are also highly capital-intensive and thus become tightly bound to finance capitalism and to expectations for a positive return on shareholder investment. Thus, even though green energy projects typically speak a language of environmental sustainability, the growth imperative of dominant models of economic health bleeds over into and directs them. Communities, perhaps especially indigenous communities with resources like land, water, and wind that can be harnessed for renewable energy megaprojects, often find their own interests subverted to those of states and corporations desperately searching for an alchemy of growth, profit, and sustainability in the shadow of the Anthropocene. And there are more complications still. Oaxacan wind power development needs to be understood not only as a response to climate change, but also to the vulnerability of the Mexican petrostate. Although peak oil fears have dissipated in some countries with the rise of shale oil and gas extraction, in Mexico such concerns remain both strong and empirically substantiated. Mexican heavy crude production fell 46% from 2004 to 2012, with its only supergiant field, Cantarell, running dry, and the national oil monopoly, Petróleos Mexico, Pemex, widely believed to lack the expertise and resources to effectively develop deep-water hydrocarbon resources. The Mexican petrostate thus finds itself at its own crossroads. In recent years, Pemex has supplied as much as 40% of the operating budget of the Mexican federal government, meaning that all aspects of Mexican statecraft, all these wonderful biopolitical interventions, they all depend critically upon revenue from oil sales. The crude production drop has been masked to some extent by the concomitant rise in international oil prices, which has allowed Pemex to retain high revenue. But put bluntly, the current financial model for the Mexican state is only one big drop in the international price of oil away from disaster. President Felipe Calderón's push to rapidly develop renewable energy resources was formulated in this context. As an official in the Mexican Environmental Ministry, Sener, explained to us, quote, "We need to diversify the sources of our electricity production. The hydrocarbons we don't use for our own energy consumption are hydrocarbons we can sell at a good price." This is what I have termed energopolitics in action, fuel and electricity guiding the operation of political power from within. In the fading light of the black sun of oil, new energopolitical models are emerging as part of a massive but still aptly subterranean effort to sustain the petropolitical growth model. In Mexico, political interest in the wind resources of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec dates back to the early 1990s. However, it was only during Calderón's presidency, when drug cartel power soared and oil began to wane, that a serious campaign to develop renewable energy began. New legislation was passed demanding 35% clean electricity by 2024, alongside lucrative incentives for new private-public partnerships in renewable energy development. The Mexican wind power sector exploded. In 2008, there were only 2 parks producing 84.9 megawatts. 4 years later, there were 15 parks producing over 1,300 megawatts, a 1,467% increase that made Mexico the second biggest wind power producer in Latin America after Brazil. The dominant development scheme has been industrial self-supply, autoabastecimiento, partnerships in which a private wind developer contracts to produce energy for a large industrial client such as Cemex, Walmart, or FEMSA Heineken over a period of decades. These schemes are typically portrayed as win-win-win for the government, developers, and industry. Companies can lock in lower than market energy prices for a long term, enjoy the financial benefits of carbon credits, and guarantee themselves secure energy supply. Developers enjoy special financing through schemes like the UN's Clean Development Mechanism. And states receive infrastructural development and economic multipliers without having to invest themselves. Communities are also frequently portrayed as winners in self-supply development in that they typically receive land rents and payments from usufructo area agreements. But many Isthmeños have come to doubt the benefits of autoabastecimiento wind development, and the Mareña project has helped to focus these doubts and distill them into resistance for several reasons. First, Mareña is viewed by its critics as epitomizing a general lack of transparency in the development process. What is now known as the Mareña Renovables project has shifted owners, names, and footprints several times since development began in 2003. Speculative activity was quite common in the early days of the Oaxacan wind rush, and we discovered significant evidence of a cartel-like organization either created or simply tolerated by the Oaxacan state government, in which wind developers were assigned exclusive negotiation rights over choice plots in the core wind zone. Many of these plots were flipped at a profit. again and again without informing the communities which would be impacted. Communities were meanwhile never allowed to entertain competitive bids from different developers, which set remuneration rates at a low level by international standards. Also, speculators, knowing that they would not have to see these projects through to operation, frequently cut corners in terms of community relations and engagement. Years later, many Isthmians complain of having been given insufficient or inaccurate information regarding the impacts that projects would bring. In December 2012, a federal judge issued an injunction, an amparo, to halt progress on the Mareña Park in order to investigate opposition claims that indigenous land was being expropriated without prior information and consent. A second criticism frequently raised against Mareña is that it has sought, like many wind developers, to advance its project through manipulation of local authorities rather than through consensus-building projects with whole communities. Companies fervently deny these claims, but critics contend that contracts for exploration and land use rights were facilitated by bribes paid to mayors and comisariados, collective land commissioners, in the form of cash or trucks. There are wonderful tales of mysterious trucks disgorging still more mysterious men, roaming twilight streets with suitcases filled with cash. And even when local authorities are not personally implicated in bribery or embezzlement, it's said that they share their new resources only within their own political network, thus effectively privatizing what had been initially promised as a broader social good. This points to a third general area of complaint, that wind development in the Isthmus has accentuated social inequality, political polarization, and violence by deprioritizing general social benefits, in other words, these same biopolitical schools and healthcare mentioned by Chapman, in favor of benefits to landholders. Here is where most of the land rents in the wind zone are being concentrated in new luxury homes, also cars, for the landowning class. Wind is a lucrative business for local elites and funds political campaigns in machines and towns where votes are openly sold for 600 pesos, or about $45 a head. It's also good business for the construction unions, who have in several cases provided groups of golpeadores, thugs, to intimidate, threaten, and in some cases physically attack those who resist or oppose wind park projects. The Mareña project also possesses several singularities that have helped to make it a watershed case. It's uniquely impactful in that it would be the first park to affect a plurality of lagoonal communities, all of which have traditional rights of access to fishing near the sandbar. Likewise, it would be the first park to occupy land actively administered as bienes comunales, as common rather than private property. In all other cases, wind parks have occupied land that have been privatized, whether voluntarily or by force. It's also apparently the only wind farm project in the world designed to occupy a sandbar, thus making its environmental impacts especially difficult to estimate. There's little comparative evidence available, for example, to address locally burning questions such as whether the presence of the turbines would create vibrations and shed light that would scare fish away. However, there is one causality that stands out prominently from the pack as the most immediate reason for Mareña's failure: the rise of the popular assembly network I mentioned a few minutes ago. Deserving far more than this brief mention, Simony will now turn to a deeper analysis of the origins and goals of the anti-aeolic, or anti-wind as they call themselves, resistance movement.
Okay, back at the crossroads of green capitalist development and aspirations and the barricades of Álvaro Obregón, one is struck by the sheer quantity of dust that arises when trucks roll down the road. It is reason enough to wrap a handkerchief or a t-shirt around any and all orifices. And men in Álvaro are often outfitted this way, bare-chested, with a thinning t-shirt shrouding nose and mouth just to keep the dirt out. Maybe the protective shirt is printed with the smiling face of a bygone political candidate, or maybe it is a rock and roll concert relic. In either case, the chronic cough that is audible everywhere in this little hamlet makes it seem as though this is a losing battle. Today, in front of the abandoned hacienda that the resistance has appropriated as their meeting place, t-shirts have been fashioned into masks by a group of young men with a more symbolic purpose, signaling a touch of outlaw, part Zapatista and part universal gangster. As they jump down from the back of a white pickup truck, even the t-shirt masks can't conceal the young men's smiles. They've just returned from an excursion to the site where Mareña has its test tower, a spindly metal steeple with a three-pronged wind vane to meter the quality, duration, and force of the wind. The masked men have something in hand, a prize. The crowd, numbering 70 or so, soon gathered around, eager to see what this was. Passing the booty from hand to hand with care, the object finally got close enough for us to see that it was a gauge of some kind, with settings and indicators in English and numbers on dials. It fell down, they explained to us, from the tower. Incredulous, we asked, it fell down? With their smiles growing perceptibly wider, they had decided that the bluff was not really worth pursuing any longer. Well, they concluded, it fell down when we pulled down the tower. The Mareña Project may have a powerful set of allies and all of the forces of transnational capital behind it, but it certainly does not have the approval of the men in the t-shirt masks. The anti-wind resistance has been able to catalyze challenges to wind energy development across the Isthmus, in part because they have raised explicit critiques of neoliberal forms of development and foreign financial intervention. But, as we will detail here, the resistance has also found a political purchase, not because it opposes renewable energy, they do not, but because they have surfaced concerns about both the potential social and environmental consequences that may follow in the wake of the wind park's construction. The resistance has codified a suite of concerns that range from the displacing and destructive potential of megaprojects to worries about the loss of land and fish. La laguna, la pesca, and nuestra tierra, the lagoon, the fish, and our land, have become effectively aligned in order to gesture to both quotidian practices and regional patrimony as local residents call attention to environmental and social precarities that they believe the wind parks portend. These eco-social alignments have also engendered distinct ways of imagining and articulating what I have been calling Anthropocenic eco-authority, a series of experiential, scientific, and managerial truth claims regarding ecological knowledge and future forecasting in an era of global anthropogenic change. As it is enunciated by resident communities or state officials, corporate representatives, or environmental experts, Anthropocenic eco-authority finds traction by asserting ethical claims on behalf of and in regards to the anthropogenically altered future of the biosphere, both human and non-human. As the climate scholar Mike Hullum has predicted more generally, climate change mitigation measures like those we have seen in Mexico have indeed fomented new opportunities for environmental consciousness and activism. However, it has not been the sort of environmentally oriented response that the Mareña Consortium or the Mexican state has hoped for. Although transitions to renewable energy have the ethical potential to leverage a global climatological good, when they are seen to contravene local claims for rights, autonomy, environmental knowledge, and ecological stewardship, they instead generate, as Mareña has found, the conditions for failure. Our argument, then, is that where climate mitigation efforts and renewable energy transitions are coupled with neoliberal development logics, we are likely to find resistance reinvented in collaborative and lateralist modes of activist response. The Office of the Assembly of Indigenous Peoples of the Isthmus in Defense of Land and Territory is readily identified on the streets of Juchitán. It is the one with the anti-wind turbine stencils on its facade, as you see here. As we sat down one Sunday afternoon with two of the founders of the resistance and a couple of other attentive listeners, it was hard not to notice our intimate physical proximities in this tiny room decorated with images of past victories and heroes, from Che to El Sub, that's Subcomandante Marcos of the Zapatista uprising. Roberto began our conversation and proceeded to detail the historical narrative of the resistance over the course of over an hour. Roberto is one of the primary voices of the resistance. He does not, however, like to be called a leader. This is a designation that he associates with hierarchical, vanguardist, and ultimately corrupt political forms. Roberto is a teacher by vocation and by nature, as became clear in his oration of these historical events. The resistance against Mareña, he explained, must be understood through a longer genealogy that spans many decades and locations. In addition to the insurrectionary politics of the Isthmus, particularly the early COSEI movement that Dominic mentioned earlier, Roberto linked the resistance to the repression of the student movement in Mexico City in 1968 and a guerrilla insurgency in Chihuahua before that. He referenced the Chapman rebellion of the Zapatistas following the North American Free Trade Agreement and the battle over the development of an airport in Atenco just outside of Mexico City. He likewise saw the anti-wind resistance as linked to the teachers' strike and state violence in the capital of Oaxaca in 2006, guided by APO, the Popular Assembly of the Peoples of Oaxaca, and finally to Maoism itself, with its agrarian peasant insurgencies and challenges to First World imperialism. So Roberto's cartography of revolution and response to foreign domination, urban hegemony, and rebellions against neoliberal development brought us to the origins of the anti-wind resistance in 2005. It was founded, he explained, by a group of committed teachers. He and others had protested against the installation of a wind park in La Venta, a small town, in the 1990s, noting that Subcomandante Marcos himself had shown up to speak in solidarity with them. Beyond the symbolic gestures of the Zapatista leadership, the Assembly of Indigenous Peoples could also claim several significant victories of their own. These included nullifying wind park contracts across the Isthmus region and, as Roberto put it, rescuing 1,200 hectares of land from being contracted and thus turned into wind parks. Roberto gives credit where credit is due. He is faithfully citational as he narrates the insurrectionary lineage of the resistance. Originally, the Juchitan arm of the opposition worked under the name the People's Front in defense of land and territory. However, Roberto explained the designation of front or frente is overly encumbered by vanguardism, hierarchical leadership, and a military etymology, all qualities that they hope to surpass. By consensus, it was decided that the title of Asamblea better captured their ethos. An assembly evokes, as Roberto put it, a more egalitarian notion, that of community. He went on to explain, quote, "We have traversed the entire historical process of the left in Mexico in order to be able to offer an alternative," end quote. A communitarian ethos and horizontal or lateral leadership, along with collective consensus, is emphasized in both the name, assembly, as well as in the spirit of the project, refusing leadership and leaders, and therefore implicitly a flock of followers. Dedication to the collective model is also manifest in the deeds of the resistance, who have prioritized founding more assemblies as a central part of their mission. Asambleas Generales have since multiplied across the Isthmus in towns and villages, supporting the anti-Mareña resistance. These working forms of protest and process call for collective decision-making in a reinvented use of usos y costumbres, which is literally customs and practices, a legal and social system operating in parallel to state governance in Mexico and other parts of Latin America. Usos y costumbres in general have been regarded as a counterbalance to indigenous peoples' marginalization and elite national projects in Mexico and elsewhere. And while the resistance has fostered collaborations that traverse historical divisions between local indigenous populations, they have also managed to navigate political party lines. Given the historical strength and chauvinism of party politics in Mexico, it is no mean feat for PRI party loyalists to share meals with the leftist Revolutionary Democratic Party, or the PRD, and the COSEI. Since the political parties left and right have for the most part been in favor of the Mareña project, the parties themselves have lost favor in the eyes of these meños of the resistance. In fact, they have gone so far as to summarily question the validity of political parties as legitimate democratic institutions altogether. Antonio is one of the founders of the Asamblea in Alvaro and one of the key voices of the resistance. And he explained, speaking to a crowd one afternoon in front of the hacienda, that today is a declaration of war against the political parties, against the government, against Mareña Renovables, against anyone who is allied with or affiliates with Mareña Renovables. Antonio and others in the resistance also publicly announced that no political party candidate would be allowed to campaign for political office in the upcoming municipal elections. And in June of 2013, they made good on this pronouncement by prohibiting the installation of voting machines in the municipality. The parties and the park have become a combined menace for those in the resistance, and so both have been given a directive and a direction, and that direction is fuera, or out. The political menace and social disequilibria that the wind park threatens is a critical element of the opposition's discourse and their activism. However, the impacts upon the environment and subsistence in the Isthmus are equally resonant in the opposition's claims against the park. The precise effect that the Mareña project might have on fish or on shrimp population of the lagoon and coastal waters is unclear, given the environmental impact report failed to treat this aspect of the regional conditions and the project's unique placement on the sandbar. However, in part because of this absence of scientific analysis, fears do abound. The fishermen with whom we spoke across the Isthmus region were convinced that their lives and their livelihoods would be irrevocably impaired by the development of the wind park. Ibrahim, who would emerge as one of the key voices of the resistance in San Dionisio del Mar, summarized the sentiments of many in the region when he explained the following. The wealth of our sea, of our people, of our source of work and nourishment is vital. If the wind project comes in, we will be buying foreign products coming from other places, which will make feeding ourselves more expensive. And so, in a sense, San Dionisio now sees itself, or has transformed itself, into a courageous town that defends its lands and teaches foreigners that our lands must be respected. So it is telling that Ibrahim begins his comments with the riches of our sea. For over time, as the resistance to the project grew and spread, we began to hear increasingly the expression, El mar es nuestro banco, that is, the sea is our bank. This was a canny spin on the evident presence, or perhaps better put, imposition, of banking interests and multinational capital that have backed the Mareña project. However, the sentiment that the sea is our bank is also a factual statement to a degree. According to reports, there are 5,000 indigenous families that rely on fishing for their existence. Even if the number of families in San Dionisio who survive exclusively by fishing are likely no more than a few dozen, many, if not the majority of the population, rely on fishing for a kind of security subsistence in conditions of economic and food insecurity. If all else fails, the sea is there, and you and your family can eat. Ibrahim is not naive, after all, to underscore how harm to fish and shrimp stocks will result in increased dependence on market-based fixed food supplies and further insertion into a vast chain of imported products. Many advocates, Ibrahim included, were clear that opposition to the wind park was not a refusal of its clean capabilities and renewable energy aspirations. Rather, they wanted to mount a warning and protest against the prioritization of market-based growth models spreading across every dimension of daily life in Mexico. Andrew Chapman in his baseball hat with a thrashing fish embroidered across the front and the young man behind the makeshift mast with the absconded wind meter in his hand represent very different places, both metaphorically and physically. Chapman has long since returned to New York, and the young man with the meter, he is likely either swapping stories with his friends at the hacienda that you see here, or out on the water hauling shrimp-filled nets from the lagoon by moonlight. There is no reason to make speculative parallels between the very different lives of each of these men and the economic, social, and cultural worlds that they represent. But it is fair to say that they do have shared expectations and parallel hopes for the future, if there were a way to meet at a metaphorical or actual crossroads. Each of them is able to claim a virtuous, indeed ethical position. The American bringing development, fomenting markets for renewable energy use, slowing the creep of global warming, and producing profit for investors committed to sustainability. The Isthmeño fighting for his future on the lagoon and that of his one-day children, challenging foreign invaders and transnational capital, and working to ensure food sovereignty for himself, his family, and the region. Critiquing capitalist development and creating horizontal and collective political models, the anti-Mareña actions share an affinity with uprisings and protests from Tahrir Square to Zuccotti Park. Horizontal networks function in place of hierarchies, consensus democracy replaces top-down direction, and principles of decentralization become prioritized. Reacting to these projects of green neoliberalism, the resistance has been able to recapitulate the roots of the anti-globalization movement and direct actions that, for many, originated with the Zapatistas. Like the Zapatismo formed in the Lacandon jungle, or the anti-WTO protests in Seattle, or the protests against the G8 in Geneva, or most recently to Occupy Everything across North Africa, North America, and Europe, the resistance has rejected hierarchical orders and decision-making. It has made definitive critiques of neoliberal policies and the ways in which private finance capital may engender local communities' livelihoods and well-being. And in this sense, we suggest that energy protest movements like those in the Isthmus represent an outpost of these sorts of new oppositions. However, there are at least two important distinctions to make regarding Isthmeño responses to green neoliberalism that stand apart from other occupiers' anti-globalization actions and neo-anarchist movements that have merged in other parts of the world. First is their explicit incorporation of a collaborative neo-indigenous trajectory coupled with an adherence to a communal ideology of assembly. These tactics have been seen in other Latin American struggles over sovereignty and resources, to be sure. But anti-wind protests in the Isthmus signal an emerging logic of resistance that both rejects green capitalist aspirations as well as greenhouse gas reduction as justification for territorial displacements. The second distinction to be made is that the resistance in the Isthmus is, unlike Occupy, not reacting to a global financial crisis, but instead drawing attention to protracted forms of marginalization exercised by state policies and green capitalist developers. In other words, they are reminding those that will listen that they have been the 99% for quite some time. In fact, the critique being leveled by the resistance is not aimed at the failure of global finance capital, but rather a scathing commentary on its very successful propagation across the Isthmus in the form of renewable energy projects. In place of Wall Street banks that were too big to fail, the resistance has challenged a massive renewable energy installation that, with all of its international development and corporate sponsorship, has also seemed too big to fail, and yet, as of now, has. So despite the heft of Mareña's clean energy aspirations, the occupations of roads and barricades that have revealed its debilities and its shortcomings. And in this sense, the refusal of the Mareña project is not simply a referendum on how renewable energy projects will proceed in Mexico, but a foreshadowing of potential resistances north and south, where renewable energy projects may increasingly become objects of dissent. There is likely no one in Alvaro Obregón, San Dionisio del Mar, or other communities around the Isthmus who would declare the outright opposition to preventing further climate change, or in the broadest terms, making the world and their environment a more humane and more hospitable place. However, to entreat them to sacrifice their land and fishing grounds on behalf of international global protocols and climate change mitigation mandates that are devised in Kyoto, Durban, and Copenhagen, which in turn benefit investors and developers at least as far afield, is a proposition that does not sit well in the Isthmus. Asking Isthmians to risk further precarity on behalf of global warming and an abstract greater global good may appear preferable to reenacting histories of corporate exploitation and extractivism, but this form of engineered altruism has failed to gain much traction either. The Mareña project has proven to be a critical referendum on the possibilities for renewable energy in Mexico, but it is not singular, nor will it be unique, as renewable energy projects continue to expand in Latin America and around the world. It is a lesson, moreover, in how disjointed development and failed attempts at sustainability resemble other projects that have similarly taken market-based models as the only possible, quote-unquote, rational solution to the threats of the Anthropocene. Perhaps especially in those places that have long been refused social goods and benefits promised by the state, we think these resistances, refusals, and eco-social responses highlight a very fundamental ethical challenge at the heart of renewable energy development. But in failure, we would argue, we also find opportunity. Thank you. So let me also just finish with a kind of coda here and an update. As of now, as of mid-2013, the Mareña project slowly and quietly shut down and dispersed from its occupation and plans to build on the sandbar. They have since moved in other directions. But rumor has it, and it's only rumor at this point, that they have reconstituted themselves under another name, as has been the history in the Isthmus, with many of the same forces of transnational capital, and have moved inland, so that they will produce the park, but in a different site, a different location, but many of the same actors. So thank you, and we look forward to many questions and thoughts.
Shy. I don't want to speak into the microphone. Well, thank you very much for the interesting talk. The question I have is an ethnographic question about sort of the role of activist anthropologists when you start doing ethnographic research that then complicates some of the maybe the initial impetus that might have started an interest in a project. And in your paper, the first part, when you were talking about Mr. Chapman, I became very interested in how you kind of are eager to paint him in a favorable light in some sense in order to prefigure some of the critiques that you'll later pose in the second part of the paper. And I'm interested in how you negotiate, an anthropological problem where you don't want to necessarily paint a picture of, good versus evil, but at the same time, in the end, there does seem to be a little bit of a political statement that one wants to make at the same time. So I'm curious how you negotiate that as an ethnographer.
You want to start? Yeah.
Well, I mean, in terms of negotiating our own politics and activism, because that's how you sort of began your question and the discussion, was that, you know, we both have a strong interest in the transition to renewable energy. From a political, personal point of view, we think that this is something very important that happened at the global level. So part of the impetus for this project in the first place was to try and understand how that transition might happen in a productive way. And then you see a case like the Mareña case and other instances in the Isthmus, some of which were more successful than others, continuing to fail. It's quite depressing to watch because you want to see these things succeed both for local people, indigenous and non-indigenous, as well as potentially for these green developers who putatively want to at least make more improvements to the world than their hydrocarbon cousins might, shall we say, if not, if imperfectly. And so there's a constant sort of back and forth between those positions. The other important thing, and anyone who has done field work in very hotly contested and politicized spaces knows that you're either on one side or the other. And people understand you as operating either with us or against us. And so that was a very difficult balance, I think, ethnographically, to both be accepted by the resistance. I mean, you notice we went to Alvaro and we were not attacked with machetes like they were worried would happen to Chapman. And yet Chapman and his interlocutors are suspicious of gringo anthropologists who are investigating these kinds of politics. So you have to find that balance between those two places. And yet, you know, you have some respect, I think, for, you know, green development on some level. And yet it's being carried out in a way that's not egalitarian and that's not productive and that's clearly not working for people on the ground. So it's contrary to its success.
I guess I would just add and say that I don't think that activist anthropology does itself any favors when it smooths over differences and glosses the complexities and paradoxes. And part of what's interesting about this case to us is how paradoxical certain aspects of it are. I mean, you really, you sort of want to, as an anthropologist, side with both sides for different reasons, and yet the two of them are absolutely at loggerheads, and it creates a kind of a somewhat tragic condition, really. But I really feel as though, and we talked about this endlessly, and we've actually written up a report of how this project could have succeeded. You know, there were things they could have done that would have made it acceptable to parties there. And in fact, there are models that are being developed in part by other activists for community-based wind parks that currently can't operate because of the way in which, even though there's some really nice things about Mexican renewable energy laws, some of the requirements for the amount of capital you have to have in the bank to actually win a bid to get transmission space on the grid, no poor indigenous community in Mexico could ever hope to raise that kind of money without, you know, some kinds of, so there are models out there that actually could be, you know, very specific types of policy interventions that could create, you know, I think drastically better outcomes. And if that, you know, if we want to hang our activist hat anywhere, it might be there.
Very much. I was really interested in what you said about. Sorry. Thank you very much. In thinking about the forms of politics that emerge, and what you said about how you're kind of predicting after this, you're willing to say that there's something about green capitalism and the forms of kind of the paradoxes of neoliberal sustainability projects that produce a certain kind of politics or that have a relationship to a certain kind of resistance that takes this form. And I'm curious what you think the mechanisms are of that. That is, I can see how, you know, insofar as neoliberalism produces and promotes a form of decentralization and kind of fetishizes a certain kind of participation. You know, is this in some ways an articulation with that through another mode of decentralization and participation? Is it more oppositional to that? Like, I'm kind of curious how these lock in together and what the mechanisms you see are between this kind of paradoxical neoliberal project and the kinds of politics it produces.
I guess so. Yeah, there's something generative happening here, and it's a good question to sort of think about, you know, what is, you know, where is it actually happening? And so maybe that could also be thought of, if you wanted to, as points of intervention, as well as analysis. I really think, and somebody mentioned this, in her half, but I could easily, and I did my half too, I suppose. But the focus on the sort of the market-based intervention, the growth model especially, it was really interesting to hear sometimes these very young activists who were so like, well, okay, so we're going to give them our land. They're going to build a wind park, and that energy is going to go help build a Walmart next door, in which we are going to shop for all of our things. And they said, this isn't sustainable. I mean, they was like, they could see it, which was, that was the crux of it for them. Like, this isn't a sustainable model. This is a model that actually, and of course, this is sort of the stuff we say up here too in the North, but it was, for them, it was this, we have, it's a modest life way, but we have a way that's sustainable, and many of us, enjoy it to some extent. And what's being offered as development is this particular pathway that both creates conditions of risk, and there was a lot of talk about having the fish, and the park developer says it's crazy. The fish won't even notice these wind parks being there. But so there are all of these sort of theories of why the fish wouldn't like the wind parks because of vibration or light, and so. But anyway, conditions of risk as they're locally perceived, with no sort of compensatory reward that they could understand as being beneficial, because really it was just going to lead to sort of more disposable waste. And if we had been able to show you more pictures of Juchitán, which is the district capital, it's a place that's like overwhelmed with garbage. There's just garbage everywhere, and disposable styrofoam plates, including at the place where the hacienda is. And I think they sort of saw this as being like, this is the problem, right? It's not, the wind parks are contributing to that. And that raises the next question, which is, well, is there an alternative sort of form of modernity that's being envisaged here that's better than that sort of market consumption-driven modernity? And that's an interesting question, and like, as is so often the case, it's unclear and ambiguous what exactly that alternative might involve. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question, actually. I mean, if I heard it right, that kind of a neoliberal model is being actually mirrored and modeled through these activist responses, right? Decentralized, maybe not individualized in the kind of classic neoliberal way, trying to try and create a more sort of collective and communal approach to it, but that it's sort of mirroring that process. And so I think hypothetically it is, discursively and in the voices of activists, they would refuse that entirely. But I think the other way in which it is neoliberal is that it has these processes, as they've unfolded in the Mareña case and in others, have also increased social inequality in the region. And this is something that people voice. And so that's another interesting point where it kind of marries up with this idea of the neoliberal project writ large, right? So that it's landowners with the fancy houses that are accruing more and more wealth and more status. And so there's a creating, more hierarchy, more marginalization among certain populations. Right?
And if this sounds just parenthetically, if this sounds to you a lot, for anyone who knows Mexico, like it's participating in a very like longue durée, Mexican revolutionary discourse about overthrowing colonial hierarchies, it absolutely is, and it's really, the reference is very clear to them. Like, it's about, I don't know if you could see, but on the walls is like, Zapata lives and things like that, are everywhere. In the sort of, the visual language of the movement. So there's a sense in which they feel as though like every generation of this has to rise again against the same forces, and that Mareña and its financiers are simply the latest instantiation of this, and they will throw themselves against it too in the hopes of being able to slow it down or overturn it.
Yeah, I was just putting that one out there so you can see.
So I have a question that sort of picks up on these same themes, which is I was really struck both in your analysis and in some of the materials from, in fact, the resistance that you showed, how this concept of alignment is working, both in terms of the eco-social alignments of the lagoon, the land, the fish, and also of, I think there was like the people who are allied or affiliates of the corporation were also seen as what's to be resisted. And I'm wondering, I mean, I was too wondering if there's anything besides just a general sort of neoliberal logic that's responsible for this resistance that's developed. If there, I mean, obviously it sounds like the inequalities that are developing in the community are critical for understanding this, and even the sort of generic we or us who's going to benefit from these products, it's maybe that's differently experienced by different people. If like there's, you know, if everyone is going to benefit from it, it seems like there's suspicion that maybe some people will benefit more than others, and that you've been seeing in like the rise of these homes. I'm wondering if there are like new sort of like what sort of new, whether it's what language we want to use, like alliances or publics or sort of collectives are coming into being. I mean, this assembly that's being formed, is it a recapitulation of these older politics, or are we seeing sort of fundamentally sort of new coalitions that are being created through this somehow, I guess?
Mm-hmm. I mean, in some sense, it is a revitalization of usos y costumbres, right, that exists in many parts of Oaxaca and other parts of Mexico as well, but has deteriorated in some pockets of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. So there's a kind of revitalization happening around those particular political practices, right, which are sort of customary law is another way of putting it. So you have two layers of essentially governance. And so there is a reinvocation of that. Sometimes it works more effectively than others, but it tries to be horizontal. So I think that's an important piece of it, is that they're trying to sort of reestablish that. The other thing I think is very interesting that's going on here, and we don't get to this very much in the paper, is this kind of fusion or alliance, if we want to use those terms, between human rights and environmental or ecological rights. The way that the two are being articulated in ways that bring them together in a way that they might not have been able to do before the advent of the Anthropocene, frankly. Before we had global discourses about climate change remediation, IPCC reports, and understanding about climate change, that you can even hear people on the ground who maybe aren't, you know, connected to the media in ways that we are, have an understanding of it. And so the existence of that, or the awareness of that, allows for these fusions between those two facets, I would say, that are generally kept separate. So I think when we hear these stories about, you know, what will the fish do to our subsistence and our livelihood, you're starting to see some of these articulations between environment and human rights. So I think that's a very interesting question. And then, of course, the larger ethical question about these spaces where renewable energy projects are happening. They have to happen somewhere. And they often happen in these more marginalized spaces, more rural spaces where the wind always seems to blow or the sun shines. They need to occur someplace, and they're probably invariably human beings living there. So how do you manage those ethical contingencies between the rights and desires of local populations who are either the beneficiaries or the victims of these projects, or maybe something in between, and this larger global claim to remediate climate change, which is at least putatively for the good of us all, including those local populations, right? So there's a conundrum here, and I think that's part of, you know, the interesting and also troubling impasses that we've been seeing in this project.
Yeah, I would just add briefly that you know, it's not traditionalist, it's definitely neo-traditionalist what's going on. This community, Avaro, that we were talking about, never had usos y costumbres, which is really like an alternative to the political party, like the liberal democratic political party. This was a group, it was a community that was settled by families that had supported a particular general whose hacienda is this ruin right here. So they you know, were settled there, and so in a way they were part of, you know, the modern sort of situation of war and its aftermath. And so the turn towards usos y costumbres is really being seen as a kind of, you know, political intervention against certainly the state, right, and against, at a moment that, you know, they feel that the Isthmus has been, with all of its riches, has long been a target of all sorts of, you know, predatory extractive projects, right? Going back to like a Panama Canal plan that went through the region, like all the way, you know, goes way back. So that's that. And the other thing I'll say, that, because this is like, you know, all politics is local, that part of what was happening in Alvaro at the time was a rejection of Kosei's historical influence over this area. Kosei was a kind of a revolutionary movement in the 1980s, but it had once it sort of successfully challenged the authority of the PRI party, it sort of its its leaders fell into like competition with each other and now kind of run the city of Juchitán kind of like gangs. But it's orderly, but it's like there are different sections of the city that are controlled by different sort of mafias, if you will, associated with these leaders. And one of them held Alvaro under their grasp for many years, and it was used as like a voting base for, you know, this particular faction to sort of get its part of the city finances, if you will. And so there was this specific kind of long history there of like kicking Kosei out, kicking the parties out meant rejecting this sort of vassalage that they felt like they had been held under. And so, I mean, it's so fine-grained, but that was actually a really critical part of this too.
Thanks, I really enjoyed that a lot. I was just wondering if you've seen any resistance to the resistance yet? I mean, or in other terms, given the growing social inequalities that you were alluding to, if there are sort of factional divisions within indigenous communities in terms of how they think these issues should be dealt with. And I guess I'm thinking about some of the critiques that have come out of a lot of the literature on indigeneity that can often cast indigenous activists as relatively elite actors within such communities who are often playing their own politics vis-a-vis others who might have other kinds of agendas, or perhaps actually seek a different kind of relationship to the problem.
I mean, certainly in Oaxaca City and in Mexico City, because we did a lot of field work in both of those locations too, talking to bureaucrats and government officials, bankers, corporate officials. Certainly the resistance is cast as kind of the classic vanguardist, troublemaking middle class, rallying the indigenous peasant class to, you know, to their own desires, and sort of funneling those energies. That is the accusation that is held against them, unsurprisingly, I think. In terms of indigenous sort of battles between different indigenous populations, I mean, one of the things that people described a lot of times was that this was a new form of alliance between two indigenous groups that had historically been at loggerheads and had been conflicted for literally hundreds of years, and that's the Wave who live closer to the ocean and the lagoonal area, and the Zapotec, which are much more populous and much more powerful indigenous group in the region. So one of the things we heard a lot is that, you know, resistance to the wind park has actually brought these two groups together in a way that they never were before. So that is the claim, that there's a new kind of cohesion and alliance between these groups. However, I mean, we mentioned that it was teachers, you know, who began, and the job of being a teacher in Mexico is a very good job, right? Maybe it's not highly paid, but it's secure. It's a relatively good government job. And so, you know, some of these leaders who don't like to be called leaders are in fact middle class. And some of the people in the resistance are quite middle class. So I don't think we want to portray this as, you know, entirely marginalized populations, but some people are.
But the interesting thing was that when they started to, like, because we didn't talk about this a lot, but there was a lot of intimidation, a lot of violence directed against this movement. And actually, you know, to the company's credit, I think the Chapman who said, like, we have told that all of our allies do not hurt anyone. If we see you hurting people, we're going to walk away, because that's not what our shareholders and so forth want to see. And I think there's evidence that they were actually not saying, like, go out and by any means necessary, you know, because they could have disappeared most of these people. They threatened them. They broke into the community radio station, destroyed the equipment, but it was never violence, or rarely violence against people, although there were a lot of death threats. Still, people took those death threats seriously and disappeared. So a lot of these leaders who were the sort of the teachers were gone for long stretches of time in hiding in Oaxaca City and Mexico City and other places, because they knew that there were sort of local hit squads that were associated with both the Kosei and the PRI factions, both of whom supported the park, who were after them. And but yet the resistance continued. So there was probably, you know, a kind of, you know, organic intellectual presence here, but at the same time there was obviously a strong community support and buy-in, because no matter how many people they kind of put on their watch list and scared them into hiding, the resistance just seemed to grow. So, for whatever that's worth.
I thought that was an excellently balanced presentation. Thank you. In the beginning, you mentioned sort of the claim that if, you know, once they get their money, they'll go away. You also mentioned the speculative resource rush. In my own research on energy transitions, you see a learning process occurring between communities, some of, where the resistance sort of dissipates and resolves, and people do get paid in some cases, in other cases they don't. But from a comparative perspective, were there some of these regions that you showed on the map surrounding the Mareña site, were there cases where people did get paid and the resistance did go away? And could you say something about the neoliberal success of that?
Yeah. We have 3 basic case studies. 2 are of failure and 1 is of success, if you will. Mareña is one case study because it was like the big thing that everyone was focused on when we were there last year. But then we also looked at Ixtepec, which was this community park project that never was allowed to move forward despite, a lot of planning and a lot of legal challenges to existing laws. And the third one is La Ventosa.
So there's Ixtepec up here.
Ixtepec. Can you see Ventosa on there? Let me see.
And Ventosa's right there, that yellow one.
And La Ventosa is one of 2 towns in this area that's completely encircled by wind parks now, and where all of the growth has really been happening. La Ventosa is also a migrant community that's like a little over 100 years old. And so there's not been like a long set of connections to particular land in that way. Also, it's an area that, through a series of battles back in the Kosei era, became privatized. So when what's his name, Salinas sort of like ended the Hiro system and said you can begin to privatize your land if you choose to do so, this area was one that was privatized, which meant that in the case the company was dealing with private landholders with specific plots of land instead of dealing with the whole community, where half of it or more felt that they had been disenfranchised in the process. And in those cases where there was a private property regime, it worked better and people seemed to be happier. Although still, in terms of the general social benefits that have sort of been promised, they're still very slow in coming, because typically they'll create some like a little children's park, and then almost all the money is going directly into the. And the company says, well, we're paying the leaders, and if the leaders don't use it to build a healthcare thing, what's that, right? Why is that our business? But that's part of this. What people, disagree with the model is that there isn't like a stronger emphasis on building, community benefits. And in most of the cases, if the company had come in for a couple of years and done a lot of community work, I think that it would have been a much different process to what happened. What am I forgetting?
One of the great statements that we got from a state-level bureaucrat in Oaxaca City was that one of the reasons that Mareña was such a debacle in the midst of when it was happening is because they threw so much money around. It's like the expectation is that leaders will be given something, that they'll redistribute some of that wealth to the communities. They'll probably keep some of it for themselves. There's this understanding about graft and corruption, but that Mareña, in fact, sort of, doubled, tripled, quadrupled the amount of money that they were sort of tossing into the hands of the golpeadores and the guys in the white trucks who would drive by at night and do these death threats. So, that's one of the conditions. One of the other conditions is that in places in the Isthmus where you do have private property, there were people who got wind of the wind parks early on, and surprisingly bought up tracts of land that were basically, unusable for anything else like agriculture, but were very suitable for placing turbines. And so one of these people has been described as a super cacique. If you know what an epithet cacique is, sort of strongman leadership where you dominate, your local population. This guy's a super cacique because he bought up all this land and it's gaining incredible wealth from the rents for road placement, for turbine placement, et cetera. So again, that's that inequality, but people know, everyone in the region sort of knows this person and knows the story behind it, so it's understood. And so just to emphasize what Dominic was saying, there's the distinction between collectively held land and how that gets managed, and then wealth portioned, and the privately held land. And you have it all happening in this one little region. San Dionisio del Mar is collectively held land. If you want to do anything on that land, you have to meet with the 300 comuneros and get their agreement about it. But if you go over to Juchitán, you can do a contract with a local landholder, pay him his rent, and you're set. So they're very different models. And so this case of Mareña was the first that they were trying to negotiate with communally held land. Also, I don't know if this came across, Alvaro Obregón is over here. The reason Alvaro is so important in this story is because it is at the entrance to the sandbar, which is the only way that the company could get its equipment onto the sandbar, except coming by boat. And it had some strategies to come by boat, but there was a lot of reaction to these docks being placed there too, because of very shallow waters, and that was going to have an
Yeah,
environmental
right.
impact.
So if you remember, if those of you who read Tim Mitchell's excellent book, Carbon Democracy, he talks about the choke points where coal
Yeah.
miners could like actually, that like a
Yeah.
lot of what we think of being the sort of institutions of social democracy can be traced back to coal miners specifically in their strikes, because they could stop. Coal's very heavy and can only move in certain ways, and they could block, rail lines in ways that could extract political concessions that other types of union activity couldn't. And in a way, Alvaro was able to do, and they, actually they were willing to pay them almost anything they wanted to back off, but it had become, at this point, more than about the money. They really wanted to send a signal, and they wanted to and they were very, very afraid that this sort of like ultimate safety net of the fish would disappear with the building of the park and the dredging of the lagoon. So, yeah.
The new location
Cool.
inland, where on this map, please?
Ixtaltepec,
Is it
is
up
that
there?
on here? I don't see it. And then Union Hidalgo right here.
Ixtaltepec
right up
is,
here.
yeah, Ixtaltepec, it would be right, it's kind of near.
Oh, there it is, Municipio Ixtaltepec.
It's like in this
Yeah.
area, because a little bit of it goes onto Juchitán then too.
And then Union Hidalgo, which is right here. And so these are all, they're all spectacularly productive sites for.
If you go back to the wind map, you have to understand like the wind, where it's like sort of purple and red is off the chart wind. I mean,
Yeah, this
literally,
red, yeah, over here.
tropical storm force winds are blowing. Like hundreds
Mm-hmm.
and hundreds of trailers just get knocked over by this wind. It's incredibly fierce.
18-wheel
Yeah.
tractor trailers, trucks.
It made the
get blown over.
recording of the interviews we did and so forth almost impossible, because all you got was wind sound. It's incredible. And that's why they want it. And the other thing that you should know is that the expected return rate on an investment of a bank in this region, it took us a lot of detective work to find this out, but finally we found a very friendly banker who just walked us through all the numbers, 15% return on investment. So in an era in which, what do you get in a bank these days when you put it, what's your CD giving you, 0.05% interest or something?
15%
So if you could
return.
get a virtually guaranteed 15% return, like financiers are lining up. I mean, there's no shortage of capital ready to come into this region because of that. That's how much energy. And it's in part because Mexico has incredibly high electricity tariffs, especially for businesses. It deeply discounts domestic use, but keeps very high levels for businesses. And so companies can get a long-term fixed rate, which they like, a little bit lower than market. And that's why they're willing to sort of agree to buy electricity for 20 years from one of these parks. And
It's cheaper, and they get a green profile.
and they get a green pro. They get to
internationally.
say
Look
we've
good.
getting all this, So they're getting
know.
a good deal symbolically and financially. And then this just gives them the banks like an enormous return on investment that they're very happy with. And so you can see why the engine keeps moving and keeps looking for new space to acquire. And they started in the sort of more simple sort of private property zones that somebody was pointing out before, but now they're increasingly expanding towards the communally held lands too, looking for a new project.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a small question, really. Thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed it. I was just curious, both in your presentation and then also in the images, it seems like this is an extremely gendered political economy and political practice, right? There's lots of discussion about men with their shirts off, men with guns, men in back of trucks. And even in the images itself, I think I maybe saw one woman, and she was standing next, she wasn't holding a sign, but there was a child who maybe looked male, was carrying a sign. So I wondered if you could just comment briefly on the role of women's participation in these kinds of movements, or what their what their role is in these kinds of politics.
I mean, compared to the work that I did on gender and sexuality movements in Nicaragua, it's incredibly masculine gendered, this project. I mean, for me personally, it was very noticeable how much time we spent interviewing, spending time with men in these committees and these asambleas. So it's largely gendered male. But there are women who are participating in the resistance, and they are incorporated through the kind of predictable rubrics of family and preserver of tradition and culture, right? So when we went to this protest in Mexico City that you saw a couple of slides from that, women they came on the bus from the Isthmus, and they were wearing very traditional clothes, and they wore those throughout the protest in order to kind of signal their indigeneity. And it's not that they don't also wear those clothes at home, but it definitely marks out something different in the urban metropolis of Mexico City and makes a statement. And so there was actually one slide here that I included because, and this is kind of what I'm referring to, but there's one woman who's quite prominent in the movement, and she has gotten international recognition. She was involved in COSEI, this radical student movement, back in the 1980s when she was 13 years old. She's very leftist, and she's been involved in all kinds of resistance for a long time, and she is an important figurehead in the resistance. But you are correct that it is largely gendered male.
Thank you guys so much. I just wanted to ask, what are the ways that that the media has been involved in making this resistance successful or bringing it to light? And are the producers of that media these people themselves who are mobilizing, or are you seeing like journalists from Mexico City coming to Oaxaca? Or could you explain that role a little bit?
You're the media guy.
I'm the media guy, yes. Simony did work on activism before I did work on media, so we tried to bring in some of our, attentions and expertise there. There was a lot going on, and media played a really important, interesting role in this. One thing that the Asamblea movement was very good at was using social media, particularly to connect with each other, and also as a platform for producing, sort of a particular kind of visualization of their own victimization by the company. Anytime I mentioned that they use pepper spray, and when they did videos and put them on YouTube of women whose eyes were tearing because they'd just been pepper sprayed. And when there was a guy who was beaten up and had his arm broken, and so that became part of it. And these images are very powerful, as you know, and there are networks that are set up throughout the world to get these. And so part of the way that this one woman, Bettina, got so famous was in one part because she had help from some canny leftist activists in Mexico City, but in part because she was able to fit into a certain slot of the kind of, and really played her part extraordinarily well, of being the voice of the indigenous, the sort of disappearing indigenous subject, and did tours of Europe. She went to the European Parliament. She had a tour all across Europe. Not her, she's another woman who was important in the movement, but I don't think we have a picture of Bettina there.
But if you went into Google and put in Wind Parks Oaxaca, Bettina would come up as one of the first videos. You would see her.
So and that was a lot of because their strategy was multi-pronged. It was have barricades in the Isthmus, but also place pressure on these companies back home, because one of the big investors was the Dutch pension fund, whose acronym I can't remember right now. PGGM. And so they wanted to make sure that the European press got tales of the way in which these green energy projects were coming only at, sort of from the skin and the livelihood of indigenous peoples, because they knew people in Europe would not be happy about that. So they got journalists from the Dutch press to come and write stories, and and AP did a story on it too, or two stories maybe on it. So they got some pretty high-level contact just by doing a fairly good job of orchestrating media coverage of the movement. And it definitely, it wasn't just 20 people, it was way more than 20 people involved in this. But it wasn't thousands and thousands probably either, and they made themselves seem much larger by very carefully orchestrating. In the movie, and then they got these guys to do this really, really interesting, what's it called? Somos Viento, like We Are the Wind. If you just type that in, there's an English language version that also tells part of this story that includes some kind of sophisticated graphics and things like that they put together with a production company that sort of tells the story of their fight against these big predatory wind companies. And then that got out, and it was shown. We went to a screening in Oaxaca City. It got to Mexico City. It may have gotten even farther on YouTube. It's hard to say. So they used all the media at their disposal in ways that were quite interesting. Again, I don't know whether that augurs anything about the future of these types of movements elsewhere in the world, or whether this was an isolated event, but it was quite impressive.
The resistance and activists were very sophisticated in their use of spectacle, like he was just describing, and the ability to sort of film something immediately, load it up onto YouTube in some form. We actually were the object of one of those interventions at one point where we had some video footage and then we were contacted by someone saying, you need to give us this so that we can edit it down and put it up onto YouTube right away. So there was a real awareness of that. But I think the other important piece of it is the national and the state level press, which is private and institutionalized, and also, according to journalists that we interviewed, can be purchased for a price. This was what they described. So that at one point during the resistance to Mareña, we saw the press coverage change pretty dramatically from the press reports that were coming out of Mexico City and Oaxaca City. All of a sudden, Mareña was being painted in much more positive and flattering terms. And as we talked to journalists, working journalists, they said, well, they've purchased this space. The company has purchased, a better spin on what's happening. So manipulation of the press and of journalists. There were lots of stories of journalists who were being flown to Spain to see how great wind parks were in Spain. There were stories about journalists being provided very, Tony prostitutes and taken to, these were the stories. Were they real? We don't know, but these were the kind of rumors that were circulating, that the press was being purchased at all different dimensions. So.
Would you just quickly tell us about a duograph?
Oh, thank you. Sorry that we pitched that one out there. Well,
You can start it.
Okay, so one of the things you're facing in doing, and we're interested as we were going along in this project about what's collaborative research in anthropology today, and thinking about new ways of doing that, because it's hard when the rubber hits the road of things like tenure files and things like that, and actually you could both work really hard on an essay together and only get half credit, right, for it because it's shared, and that's especially a disincentive for junior people who might be the people who might actually be the most interested in experimenting with new kinds of forms of ethnographic research. But yet this sort of alliance on the solo, Lone Ranger journalist style, even though we want to study globalization, but we're going to study as one person. So it's crazy. So that sort of inspired for us thinking about how can we do this in a way that would sort of adequately represent the partnership that was involved in every aspect of it. We were there for almost every encounter. We were there at the same time. We talked about it constantly. All the work is very much, it's impossible really. We have our own interests and our own styles, but it's impossible to separate this research material. So we thought we'll try to do something that is unusual and that we'll try to publish 2 books about the same thing at the same time, which is hard sell to publishers, you can imagine, without saying we're going to do something else so interesting. And so what it's going to be is each of us have our own interests. Very briefly, mine is more sort of on power and political power and energy power intersecting. Yours is more on, authority, ecology, ecological ethics. So, there are ways, there's a really rich body material you can easily get, like a book out of each, but then we want to publish them together as a single volume. And our publisher came up with a great idea, like a Mad Magazine flip book, so it'll have 2 front covers and no back cover, and you can read it, you can read it one way, flip it over and read the other book or flip back and forth. So the book, the printed medium will be, and we call that the duograph, right? And then for the electronic edition, to create both, because we have a lot of video and audio and things we'd like to add in, to create a kind of augmented electronic edition that allows you to link between the 2 books electronically, so you can follow characters and events that, as we both talk about them, and follow them over into the other one.
Through hyperlinks in the ebooks.
Right. With also, the editor suggested as well doing commentaries, some kind of meta commentary on our takes on each other's takes, sort of thing. So, which I don't know how that could be the end of the partnership. Probably not.
I like it up to that point. I don't know.
Okay, so we'll see what happens with that. But some possibility of being able to sort of react to that and to be able to create a new sort of materialization of a collaborative research endeavor that could serve, if it was something that worked, could serve as a kind of possible prototype for future, sorts of forms of research.
So they'll both be full-length books, but shorter, because books are becoming much shorter now too, so 80,000, 90,000 words, but sort of standard length for a book, but bound together. The other piece is we'd like to do a website that has some of this material, so some of the video material that we have, audio recordings, images, maps. I mean, not a, unlimited number of things, but a kind of a resource reservoir for people to use in teaching, or to see some of these places and hear these voices that are in the text itself. So, and all of this is eminently doable according to Cornell University Press. The software is there, it's not difficult. The printing press can do this flip-sided book for not 1 penny more than it would cost to just print out a regular book. So it's real.
So it's not, I mean, this is a kind of an interesting moment in lots of ways, and also connecting to the journal too, a moment to begin reimagining the forms of anthropological publication and communication. We actually have quite a lot of technologies at our disposal, if we want to use them, to realize some things that people have been talking about for a long time. Like, wouldn't it be nice if there was multimedia in this article, right? If we could embed, video within a journal article, or if we could, imagine new forms of, augmented book experiences that are principally web-based.
Yeah, or even methodologically to be able to do a truly collaborative project from front to finish, but then at the end be able to surface your own analysis and your own argument as an individual, right? Without having to kind of negotiate or boil it down or up, depending on how you want to look at it, to a kind of consensus agreement about what the case study says. Because each of us have our perspectives and our theoretical orientations, and to be able to surface that argument out of a collaborative project, I think, is an advantage too, and might encourage more collaborative research if there are a way to do that.
If you could see different participants' voices in the final products, I think people might be more amenable to this idea that it still counts, right? Because you can hear, because there's something like when you write together, there can be a tendency to kind of find a lowest common denominator you can both agree on. But if you disagree, which we did, because we had talked a lot and we had different interpretations of different events, and shouldn't that also be part of the record? Right, that you two people who were in all the same encounters still saw it differently. Isn't that something that should be part of the ethnography too?
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Great
you.
questions.